can just, it's like a jam. And it's just, they know what they're doing, where they're going, you know?
Let me just play this. I mentioned...
For years, Mike Stern's playing burned with fire, fluid, soulful, electrifying, echoing the mentorship of Miles Davis, the man who pulled him from obscurity and hurled him into the spotlight. Their collaboration defined an era of jazz fusion, yet behind the blistering solos and onstage bravado, there were shadows, moments Stern never dared to speak of. Every interview dodged, every memory blurred in half-answers, leaving fans to wonder what really happened in those years by Miles's side. Now, at 72, Mike Stern finally opens up, and what he admits about Miles Davis doesn't just peel back the curtain on their turbulent partnership. It rewrites everything we thought we knew about the master and his protege. But what truth could be so powerful, so unsettling, that Stern stayed silent for nearly half a century? Mike Stern was only 26 when his phone rang with the kind of call that could change or destroy a life. On the other end was a voice that carried the weight of an era, Miles Davis. By then, Davis had already rewritten jazz 3 times over, from bebop to cool jazz to fusion. But in the late 1970s, his name had taken on a darker glow. He was a legend, yes, but also a man veiled in mystery, silence, and rumors of excess. And now, he wanted Stern on guitar. The young guitarist had been clawing his way through New York clubs, building a reputation as a technical wizard with a fire in his hands. But this wasn't just another gig. Playing for Miles was like standing before a volcano. You never knew if you'd be lifted to the heavens or swallowed whole. Stern knew it, and the night he walked into the rehearsal room, guitar case in hand, he felt the air change. Musicians whispered that Miles didn't just hire people, he tested them. That first night was chaos. Miles walked in late, draped in a cape that seemed more suited to royalty than music. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He counted off a tune, and suddenly, Stern was in free fall. The band was a storm. Al Foster on drums, Marcus Miller on bass, Bill Evans on sax, and Miles, with his horn held like a weapon, cut through the noise. Stern had never played with this kind of force behind him. His fingers bled across the strings, and yet Miles just stared. No nod, no approval, only silence. It was only after the set that Miles leaned in, his voice low and raspy. "You sound good, but don't play so many notes. Make me wait." For Stern, it wasn't just advice. It was a commandment. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just joining a band. He was entering a crucible. Everything he thought he knew about music, about life, was about to be burned down and rebuilt by Miles Davis. That night marked the beginning of a relationship that would define Stern's life. Brilliant, brutal, and dangerous. And as he would later admit, it was also the start of a descent into darkness that nearly killed him. Behind the glow of the spotlight, Mike Stern's world was unraveling. The pressure of playing with Miles was like carrying a mountain on his back. Every night, he stood on stage knowing that one wrong note could end it all. And off stage, the temptations of the late 70s music scene swallowed him whole. Stern had already been flirting with heroin when he joined Miles. In the clubs, it was everywhere, passed around in the shadows, whispered about like a dangerous secret. At first, he thought it helped him play, that it calmed the nerves and smoothed the edges. But addiction doesn't bargain. It consumes. Soon, the drugs weren't a choice, but a chain around his neck. Even Miles, who had his own history of demons, noticed. Musicians in the band whispered about Stern's nodding head, his disappearing act between sets. Some nights, he barely made it to the stage, his fingers trembling, his mind fogged. But Miles didn't fire him. Instead, he let him crash, burn, and crawled back, over and over again. It was as if Miles wanted Stern to fight through the darkness to see whether the music or the madness would win. The drugs took everything. Stern pawned gear, lost friends, and sank deeper into a haze that nearly cost him his life. He remembered waking up in strange apartments, not knowing how he got there. He remembered walking into rehearsals, unable to play a single clean note. And yet, every night, the audience only saw brilliance, the illusion of control. It all came crashing down one night when Stern overdosed and collapsed backstage. His bandmates found him crumpled, barely breathing. For a moment, it seemed the rising star had burned out before he even reached his peak. But against all odds, he survived. The wake-up call should have been enough. But addiction doesn't loosen its grip so easily. Stern's road to rock bottom was only beginning. For all the chaos, there were moments, small, quiet, unforgettable, when Miles Davis pulled Mike Stern aside and revealed truths that would stay with him for life. Miles was not a teacher in the traditional sense. He didn't sit down and explain scales or harmonies. His lessons came in fragments, whispers, riddles that seemed meaningless at first, but turned into revelations years later. One night after a show, Miles leaned close, his breath heavy with cigarette smoke, and said, "Don't play the guitar, play the silence around it." Stern didn't understand. He was young, hungry, ready to show off everything he knew. But Miles kept pushing him. Fewer notes, more space. "Let them beg for the sound," Miles said. It was philosophy as much as music. Stern would later admit those words changed not only how he played, but how he lived. There were other lessons, too, some cruel, some kind. Miles had a way of humiliating his musicians in front of audiences, then lifting them up in private. After a disastrous solo one night, Stern thought he was finished. Miles walked off stage, looked him in the eye, and simply said, "You scared?" Stern nodded. Miles smirked. "Good. Stay scared. That's when you play honest." These whispers weren't just advice. They were lifelines. In a world where Stern's addiction threatened to destroy him, Miles's words anchored him. They gave him a sense of purpose beyond survival. Yet they also came with a price. Miles demanded absolute devotion, and Stern gave it, even as it pulled him deeper into the abyss of drugs and chaos. Years later, Stern would look back and realize that Miles wasn't just teaching him to play guitar. He was teaching him to endure, to take the pain, the fear, the silence, and turn it into sound. And though Stern didn't know it at the time, these lessons would one day save his life. Mike Stern's guitar became more than an instrument. It was a mask. On stage, he was electric. Fingers flying, chords burning, solos screaming like a man possessed. The audience saw fire, brilliance, and confidence. What they didn't see was the fear, the self-doubt, and the needle marks hidden beneath his sleeves. For Stern, the guitar was both salvation and prison. Each night, as the lights hit his face, he buried the chaos of his private life under a wall of sound. The roar of applause drowned out the whispers of addiction, of shame, of the loneliness that gnawed at him. He played louder, faster, fiercer, not because he wanted to impress, but because silence terrified him. Silence meant facing himself. Friends in the band began to notice. They saw the tremors in his hands before the set, the way he disappeared into bathrooms for too long, the glassy look in his eyes when he returned. But when the music started, all doubts evaporated. Stern became a giant, a guitarist who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Miles Davis himself. That contradiction, chaos off stage, brilliance on stage, made him both admired and pitied. Miles once confronted him after a particularly rough night. Instead of firing him, Miles handed Stern his horn and said, "Play this." Stern laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Miles didn't smile. "You hide behind the guitar. What happens when it's gone?" Stern froze. It was one of the cruelest truths anyone had ever thrown at him. He realized then that Miles could see through the armor, but instead of pulling back, Stern doubled down. The more his life unraveled, the more ferociously he played. Critics raved about his raw emotion, calling him one of the most fearless guitarists of his generation. They didn't know that fear was exactly what drove him. Each note was a confession, a cry for help hidden in plain sight. The guitar gave him a way to scream without anyone realizing how broken he really was. The jazz world can be as cutthroat as it is beautiful, and for Mike Stern, betrayal came from where he least expected it. By the early 1980s, his reputation as Miles Davis's fiery guitarist had opened doors. He was suddenly in demand, not just for Miles, but for other band leaders who wanted the magic Stern carried. But with opportunity came jealousy. The wild-haired kid who once hid behind distortion and heroin has transformed into a man unafraid of silence, of vulnerability, of truth. And now, after decades of whispers, Stern is finally telling his story. In recent interviews, he has spoken with candor about the years with Miles Davis, the chaos, the torment, and the brilliance. He admits that Miles both saved and destroyed him, that the lessons were as painful as they were priceless. "Miles gave me my voice," Stern has said, "but he also pushed me to places I wasn't ready to go." For years, he avoided these conversations, burying the pain beneath polite anecdotes. But age has softened him. He no longer fears the truth. Stern has also opened up about his addiction, something he once considered too shameful to discuss. He speaks not as a cautionary tale, but as a survivor, someone who knows the darkness intimately, yet refuses to be defined by it. "Music saved me," he says, his voice steady. "It was the one thing the drugs couldn't take away." His honesty resonates with younger musicians who face their own battles, proving that the jazz world's myths of self-destruction are nothing but traps. And then there is the music itself. Even now, Stern plays with the fire that first caught Miles's attention, but it's tempered by reflection. His notes breathe, linger, and carry the weight of lived experience. No longer hiding behind speed or volume, he allows space for silence, for the lessons Miles once whispered, for the ghosts of his past, for the gratitude of still being alive. At 72, Stern doesn't need to prove himself. He doesn't need headlines or validation. What he needs, and what he has finally claimed, is peace. His story is no longer about the fall, it's about the survival. He lived through the shadow of Miles Davis, the grip of heroin, the betrayals, the collapse, and the redemption. And in breaking his silence, he has given the world something greater than another solo. He has given us the truth. Mike Stern's voice, once drowned in chaos, now rings clearer than ever. Not just in the strings of his guitar, but in the words he finally dares to speak. And that, perhaps, is his greatest solo of all. If a secret has survived this long, should we leave it buried? Or ask why it was guarded so fiercely? At 72, Mike Stern finally speaks of Miles Davis, but the meaning of his words depends on how deeply we choose to hear them. Before memory fades and silence returns, remember, some stories refuse to die. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. One night, after a blistering performance in Europe, Stern overheard two fellow musicians mocking him behind his back. They said he was nothing without Miles, just another junkie guitarist who would burn out before 30. The words cut deep. These weren't strangers. They were people he considered brothers on the road. The betrayal was like a knife, but worse was yet to come. A promoter who had promised Stern a solo opportunity suddenly pulled out, claiming that Miles had ordered him to. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. The message was clear. Stern's fate still belonged to Miles, and everyone knew it. Instead of being recognized for his talent, he was seen as a shadow, a man whose only worth came from the legend he served. The final blow came when a record executive told him, bluntly, "We can't sell you. You're too unstable, too risky." Stern had poured his soul into demo tapes, trying to show he could stand alone. Instead, the industry labeled him damaged goods. For a man already teetering on the edge, it was devastating. He spiraled deeper into addiction, convinced that everyone was waiting for him to fail. The betrayal by friends, the silence of the industry, the suffocating grip of Miles's shadow, it nearly destroyed him. For the first time, Stern considered walking away from music entirely. He wondered if the guitar, once his shield, had now become his curse. Miles Davis had a way of breaking people down, then rebuilding them in his own image. To some, it was genius. To others, it was cruelty. For Mike Stern, it was both. Miles loved pushing his musicians to the edge of collapse, testing their limits until they either soared or shattered. Stern was no exception. On stage, Miles rarely gave direction. He thrived on chaos. One night, he'd signal for Stern to solo for minutes on end, forcing him to carry the weight of the band. Another night, he'd cut him off after just 2 bars, leaving him humiliated in front of thousands. Stern never knew what to expect. It was psychological warfare dressed as improvisation. Offstage, the pressure was even greater. Miles expected loyalty, obedience, and total devotion to the music. He would call Stern at 3 in the morning, demanding he show up at his apartment to rehearse or just to sit and listen to records. Stern, exhausted and unraveling, always went. To say no to Miles was unthinkable. But the darker side was how Miles tolerated Stern's addiction. Some said he even encouraged it, believing that suffering created better music. "Play your pain," Miles once told him. And Stern did, until the pain almost consumed him. The press began to paint Stern as jazz's new bad boy, brilliant, reckless, untouchable. The image sold tickets, but behind it was a man drowning. Every headline that celebrated his wildness only tightened the noose around his neck. He was no longer just a guitarist, he was a spectacle, a character in the chaotic circus that surrounded Miles Davis. For years, Stern endured it, convincing himself that the abuse was worth the lessons, the stage time, the glory of playing beside a legend. But deep down, he knew it couldn't last. Miles had built him up, yes, but he had also pushed him closer and closer to the edge of destruction. And one night, on stage, that edge finally gave way. It happened in Boston, the city where Mike Stern had first cut his teeth as a musician. By then, he had been touring relentlessly, running on adrenaline, alcohol, and heroin. His body was a battlefield, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. On that night, under the bright lights, with the crowd roaring, his body finally gave out. The set had started strong. Stern launched into a solo that tore through the venue, his fingers a blur of energy. The band followed him, the music reaching a fever pitch. But midway through the next number, Stern felt it. A wave of dizziness, his vision tunneling, the strings slipping beneath his fingers. He tried to push through. It wasn't the first time his body had threatened to betray him. But this time, there was no escape. His knees buckled, and in front of a stunned audience, he collapsed. Chaos erupted. The band kept playing for a moment. Miles had drilled into them never to stop, no matter what. But when Stern didn't get back up, the music faltered. Crew members rushed on stage, dragging him into the wings as the crowd murmured in confusion. Some thought it was part of the act. Others whispered the truth. Everyone knew about Stern's addiction, and many feared it had finally claimed him. Backstage, Stern was barely conscious. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. For a moment, it seemed as though the rising star had burned out for good. Miles stood over him, silent, expression unreadable. Then he muttered something no one forgot. If he lives, he'll play better. If he dies, that's his lesson. Stern did live, but the collapse left scars that went deeper than the body. For the first time, he realized just how close he was to becoming another tragic footnote in jazz history. A talent lost to the same demons that had claimed so many before him. The collapse wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a warning shot, one that Stern couldn't ignore forever. The road to redemption was anything but straight. After the collapse, Stern tried to carry on as before, but his body and mind refused to cooperate. He was spiraling, and everyone around him knew it. Friends intervened, begging him to seek help. For years, he resisted, convinced that he could outplay his demons. But heroin doesn't negotiate. It takes and takes until there's nothing left to give. Finally, with nowhere left to run, Stern checked into rehab. It wasn't his first attempt, but it was the first time he admitted he couldn't do it alone. Withdrawal hit like a storm, shaking, sweating, nightmares that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Every day was a battle, not just against the drug, but against the voice in his head telling him he was nothing without it. Rehab wasn't just about detox, it was about rebuilding a life from the ground up. Stern picked up his guitar, hands trembling, and forced himself to play. At first, the music sounded hollow. Without the chemical haze, every mistake rang louder. Every note felt heavy. But slowly, something shifted. For the first time in years, he began to hear his true sound, not distorted by fear or addiction, but raw, honest, alive. Support came from unexpected places. Fellow musicians, even those who had once written him off, reached out. His family, weary but hopeful, stood by him. And perhaps most importantly, Stern himself began to believe he could be more than his demons. The fight didn't end with rehab. Recovery was a daily battle, one he would wage for the rest of his life. But Stern emerged with something he hadn't felt in decades: clarity. The fog was lifting, and with it came a sense of purpose. He wasn't just playing to survive anymore. He was playing to live. For years, Mike Stern wrestled with a haunting question. What did Miles Davis really think of him? Miles was notorious for withholding praise, for pushing his musicians without ever giving them the validation they craved. Stern had moments when Miles whispered encouragement, moments when he cut him down, and countless nights when he said nothing at all. But behind the silence, there were clues. Miles kept Stern in the band for years, longer than many other guitarists. He gave him space to solo, to stretch, to make mistakes in front of audiences that demanded perfection. Miles didn't do that unless he believed in you. In private, Miles reportedly told others that Stern had something rare, a fire that couldn't be taught. He admired Stern's rawness, even his flaws. To Miles, perfection was boring. What he wanted was honesty, and in Stern's playing, he heard it, even when Stern himself couldn't. There were moments of surprising tenderness. Once, after a grueling tour, Miles handed Stern an envelope full of cash, far more than the agreed payment. "You need it," Miles said simply. Another time, he pulled Stern aside and told him, "Don't sound like me, sound like you. That's why you're here." Years later, Stern would finally come to understand. Miles had seen through the chaos, the addiction, the fear. He had recognized a talent worth nurturing, even if his methods were brutal. Stern had always craved clear approval, a simple, "You did good." He never got it. But in the end, he realized he had something far more powerful: Miles's respect. That respect wasn't spoken. It was earned, carved out through pain, survival, and relentless devotion to the music. And for Stern, it was enough. At 72, Mike Stern carries the scars of a life lived on the razor's edge. His hands, once trembling from withdrawal, now glide across the guitar with a wisdom that only comes from survival.